Okay, finally, we're on to tonight's program. It's what you came for. Adriaan Dokter is going to talk to us about grassland birds on Cornell lands. Adriaan works here at the Lab of Ornithology. He did a PhD in physics and has done a lot of work on bird migration and computational work. He leads the Birdcast project, which gives us information about migrating birds and develops software tools for biologists using weather radar in research. And since 2023, he's been working on the project we'll hear about tonight. And many of us are excited about hearing this because we've collected some data, not all of it on Cornell land, some of it on Finger Lake Land Trust lands, but I'm really curious what happens with that data. So Adriaan, it's your turn.
All right, well, thank you thanks all for coming. So my name is Adriaan Dokter. I work here as a researcher. Most of you know me probably from the Birdcast project, and Birdcast actually went live a week ago with a new website. So, but I'm not going to talk about that at all tonight. What I'm going to talk about is about grassland birds. It's, to be honest, sort of a side project for myself, and I really came to it really as a birder. I live also in the northeast of Ithaca, sort of walking distance here from the lab. And we have beautiful grasslands out there right on Henshaw Road. And, a lot of you will probably recognize the sort of frustration that you sometimes have around the issue of grassland birds. Whenever it gets end of May, fields that are intensively managed for hay get mowed. And there's a lot of casualties of young grassland birds. And with myself working at the lab and not many people working on this yet, I thought okay, let's try if we can get some people together to at least start looking into the problem and start exploring, what kind of possible solutions there are to do a better job with grassland bird conservation on Cornell lands. So this talk is really focused on the lands of Cornell. I've not been doing this by myself. Both David Balter and Miyoko Chu were involved from the start. Sarah Barker was also helping and joining the project last year. But the project really has been driven by undergraduates. So we have an experimental learning grant project, as it is called. It's an opportunity for undergraduates during the summer to do some research and get their feet wet get some experience in doing research. So the project has really been sort of built around giving undergraduates that opportunity. So Matthew Gilbert and Andrew Apidio were the students in 2023. David Benfield and Santi Enriquez were the students in 2024, and last year Violet Cheng was the student working on this project. Well, I don't have to explain to you all that grassland birds, if you look at all the bird groups that we have around the world and in here in the US, if you group them in different ways, this was from the Rosenberg in 2019 paper that you might have heard about, from 3 billion birds lost in North America. The single most group that has most decline is really the grassland birds. And that's because they're being hit by so many different things at the same time, and mostly agricultural practices, early mowing that just doesn't allow these birds to reproduce on sort of monocultures and intensively managed agriculture. So it's not a North American problem. We see this all over the world, and in Asia and Europe, it's the same story, that grassland birds are our steepest decliners. And a real enigmatic species that exemplifies this is, of course, the bobolink. Also, the species that is maybe close to and dear to many of us, really a steep declining bird, pretty much all over its range. And sort of the natural range where this bird occurred, sort of in the prairie habitat, those prairies don't exist anymore. So it's sort of transitioned to a bird that's almost fully dependent on sort of human-altered habitats. And with that comes also sort of a special responsibility for us to give these birds a place to persist. So the goals of our little Cornell project was first to understand just the baseline. So where and when are grassland birds breeding on Cornell lands, and how many are there? Is it just to get an order of magnitude, how many birds are there. We also wanted to really understand better the existing practices of Cornell's land steward. And that's a very complicated story too. It's not that you think maybe of Cornell as this one university that is centrally organized. In practice, that's not true. There's like different colleges, there's like all different people that do different things and that don't talk to each other. So it's a very complicated organization, and there's a lot of different people that make decisions around what happens on Cornell lands. And of course, we wanted to advocate for better grassland bird conservation in eventually, like currently, I think, unfortunately, I have to say still, like there is not a cohesive university-wide plan for how grassland birds should have a place on the lands of Cornell, even though that Cornell owns a lot of land. So we have, that sort of, we wanted to start that trajectory in towards like that birds like the bobolink would be considered. So as a bit of an introduction for all these different players, this was from a piece that appeared in the Chronicle 4 years ago. You might have seen it, but it's been more than a year ago, so I think I can show it again. And you'll see a bit of a movie introduction of several of these stakeholders and players around this issue of grassland birds. And we start with two of our students, David and Santi, who were the CLO students 2 years ago, and they'll explain a little bit what they were doing.
Birds, amongst all bird species in North America, are the group that are in the steepest decline over the past 50 years. And a big reason for that is a loss of habitat, whether it be because forests are expanding or because more and more land is being converted to agriculture. We're here in a Cornell agriculture field, and we wanted to compare whether or not the grassland birds are able to breed in these areas of high-intensity agriculture. This area, we have an excellent experimental plot where we've paid them to offset the cost of not mowing this field for hay, so that we can compare, hopefully, reproductive success in the unmowed grassland area and the mowed less grassland area.
This morning, we came out here to nest search. In particular today, we employed a strategy called rope dragging, where the two of us hold the rope, drag it between us. That sort of increases the surface area where we can, hope to flush a bird off a nest, and at which point you go to where the bird was flushed from and look for the nest. We found 4 nests in this field in particular, and 2 of those we found prior to the mowing, and we were very hopeful but not optimistic they would survive. Both of them did. We got very lucky. If we just mowed all of our fields all the time, they wouldn't make it.
Cornell owns a lot of land in Tompkins County and further in New York, and they have a lot of influence in the region. And as students, we have some influence over that and how they manage that land. Cornell also gives us a platform to spread our message about how grasslands are in danger. The birds need this space and they are declining. They're not doing well at all. But it also gives us a platform to try to make some change in that space.
I suppose when people think about fields, you usually think about agriculture. But there are natural grasslands. There are natural species that belong in those grasslands. And if we're not, looking out for them, then they will disappear entirely.
So that gave you at least some idea of what we were doing in the field there. And this was in 2024 field season when we actually set aside a field. So we paid farm services of Cornell not to mow that field, and then to see could we monitor bobolinks there and compare the survival rates of the birds in the fields and outside the fields. So a little bit more about that in a minute. I want to sort of contrast that now with sort of on the other side of the story. I have a few more videos, but I don't want to play them all in view of the time. We might revisit them later on, but I want to show you this one, which is which shows you the complicated different sort of goals that the university has with these fields. So you'll see now Greg Johnson, who is one of the main, or used to be. He actually recently moved to a different position, but until a year ago, he used to manage the Cornell University Ruminant Center that's in Harvard. So there's a big area around Harvard that's intensively managed for hay. They produce 90 to 95% all of the hay is produced here in the county or just outside the county, which of course in a way is great, right? You don't want to bring a feed for these animals from elsewhere. It's nice if you can grow it close to home. And he sort of gives his perspective on what he's thinking about when he's managing these fields. So let's look at Greg.
The best part of my job is the cows and the farming, right? Obviously, cows are great. Most of the cows here at Cornell, if you were to look at their feed that's in front of them, somewhere between 80% and 95% of the diet that they're eating was grown on the land right around here. There is a higher protein and higher digestible fiber level when grass is cut when it's this tall. But you can see this grass is not, there's no heads on it. It hasn't headed out yet. So once we delay that cutting and the grass gets taller, that would be more of a traditional dry hay, right? Or higher fiber. But milk cows produce high quality milk, produce lots of milk, need really digestible fiber. So they need stuff that's aggressively managed, right? Chopped about every 28 days. I'm out here in my little world, I have 500 acres of grass hay that I'm chopping for these cows. And I want to put up the best quality hay that I can and have it ferment in the best way. And I want everything to be perfect for these cows. And I'm day to day not thinking about grassland management, from a bird perspective, right? I'm thinking about it from an erosion and fertility in the soil and, controlling that topsoil loss. So I think balancing the need for high quality forages for animals with delayed cuttings for grassland management, the challenges are really in trying to balance those goals. Farmers get up every day and produce food because we're passionate about food production, we're passionate about feeding the country. But I think farms at the end of the day are businesses. Incentivizing folks economically to institute new practices is a way to get change. This has a nice smell to it. I mean, you might disagree, but I think it has a nice smell. If I was a cow, I'd eat it.
Yeah, so that's Greg, and that's a totally different perspective. And that's something you have to keep in mind. The university is doing all these things at the same time. And all this research and teaching and that happens with these cows and what happens with the horses on Bluegrass Lane. There's all these different competing interests and all this call for the use of the land, and that makes this sort of grassland bird issue so complicated. And it's very much, it's not only a research or simple conservation effort. There's really all the dimensions of humans and how to work with people. Those become incredibly important also. There's a few other ones that you can check out on the website. We have Todd Bittner that we very closely work with. He's the director of the Cornell Botanical Gardens, mostly the sort of natural areas part of the Cornell Botanical Gardens. And he is much more. We've worked closely with him and sought his advice. If you listen to him, he's much more like a traditional conservationist, right? And he wants to conserve biodiversity and work on that. Or you can also listen to Mark Schrader if you go to this. I'll share the link later. Who comes in more as the sort of the director of operations, and then you'll hear a bit of the perspective of managers. But for now, I wanted to not take too much time looking at movies and dive a little bit more into the field work and the results that we actually have done over these last few years. And that work has sort of focused on roughly three main sites, I would say. So we have what I just mentioned, the Cornell Ruminant Center, which is in Hartford, a little out of the county. Interesting place to go. It's really a farm. It's a big dairy operation with a lot of cows and a lot of very intensively managed habitat. So we saw this sort of as our sort of intensively managed site as an example of it. I'm backing. This is what's happening. Then we have, this is a joke for my student, Mount Pleasant, the steepest hill in the county. And there we have this is sort of our intermediate site. So there's definitely intensively managed grassland as well. A lot of the hay that is being produced there also goes to the ruminant center to feed the cows. But there's also some research going on, so it's not as intensive as the ruminant center, but still pretty intensive. And then we have our third site, which is Dunlop Meadow, and that's within the portfolio of the Botanic Gardens, that is the site they managed to, as an example of grasslands in New York State. So it's managed for biodiversity, it's managed for bobolink, and sort of the associated flora that comes with grasslands. So we have these three contrasting sites that we looked at and tried to do field work on. And the fieldwork had sort of two components. On the one hand was the nest searching that I already mentioned. The other one was doing very much detailed point counts, where the Bird Club has actually been extremely helpful in helping us to continue those point counts on more sites and also in other years. So we had about, in 2023 and 2024, we had about 50 point counts around all these sites. And we chose for point counts because they're very standardized. You can have counts for 5 minutes within a 100-meter circle. People do that all over the country, and it's therefore easy to compare our data and the densities of birds that we get with other sites so that we can put it more into context. We really focused on the main grassland birds in our area, so bobolink, savanna sparrow, red-winged blackbird, and eastern meadowlark. Although we counted all the birds, typically we could, but those were really the main focal species because they're the most common at the moment. So over 100 species were observed so far on all these point counts, including, I was surprised how many grasshopper sparrows you start finding once you start really looking for it. There were 6 singing males found in 2023 and 3 in 2024. In 2025, I have to disclose, we didn't do any as detailed of a survey and fieldwork project as we did in the other 2 years. I'll get back to that later, but we decided to focus more then on learning about these stakeholders and what drives them. So the summer project of the student was more focused on that. So yeah, a lot of work went into nest searching and monitoring, which in 2023 happened at Dunlop Meadow predominantly, and in 2024 we had this set-aside field. So we paid the farmers like $2,000 or something it was to set aside this about 15-acre field that we could then use as a study object. And we were warned in advance that monitoring bobolink nests is really hard. And we kind of knew that. We wanted to try it nonetheless because it's a very good experience for the students to learn. It turned out to be very hard. So we tried many different things, just opportunistically finding them, rope dragging. We brought in Swan and his infrared camera, tried to find birds like that. I'm still not convinced that maybe that is maybe a way of the future, but it proved also pretty challenging. The most successful way was actually really in this narrow window when they're carrying foods, because then they're going into the nest and dropping down, and you can stand with 2 observers, and then you can sort of triangulate where you think that bird is. So almost all the bobolink nests that we did find, which were not many, were found mostly like that. And then once we had nests located, they were checked every 3 days. And here's that set-aside field. To orient you, this is just the road along Mount Pleasant. So the observatory is more on the other side, more west of us. This is sort of what you call eastern part of the eBird point is like Mount Pleasant East. where you have this field, and we had this red field that was then fully set aside, and they didn't touch it, so it allowed us to compare and find birds in those nests. So here's David and Santi again, and we also had help from Kim Zavides, who is a field tech and a researcher here at the lab. So she's extremely experienced in nest searching. She's really one of the pros. Worked on black-throated blues in many projects over the country. She said this has been the hardest species ever that I tried. Here we see a swan in action with his infrared camera on a stick. We're trying to find it. I'm still hopeful maybe if we would do it at night that maybe we would have more success. But there is definitely success in this field, of course. We had some fledglings that we just stumbled into and could pick off the ground, even on this day that we were here on this particular day. And here you see it, they're extremely hard to find, right? The person here is pointing towards the nest, so it is here, but you just don't see it, and it's actually here. Here's another example where it was here. So here's a long nest of chicks, and then we would mark it with these flagpoles so you could find it in the future, not close to it, because you want to avoid that predators might see the nest. So you always put that several steps into the northern or the direction that you decide away, so you don't attract anything. We were a little bit more successful in finding Savannah sparrow nests. So here's an example of that. In the left here, it's in the nest building stage. Here, I think there's eggs, and here there's young. But also a very difficult bird to find a large number of nests on. This unfortunately is after mowing of one of those Savannah sparrow nests that didn't survive it. But remarkably, we did find some Savannah nests. I mean, most of them don't make it, unfortunately, but it's remarkable that they're so low in the ground that some of these Savannah sparrow nests actually do survive a mow, remarkably. And that's maybe also the reason that you see these birds still on quite a lot of intensively managed fields as well, even though this is also a species that's very much in steep decline. So we found about 18 nests in 2023. In 2024, we found 24 nests. You see the success rate isn't very high. And of those, only a fraction was bobbling. So we found 5 bobblings in 2023, only 2 in 2024. And there were nests where we knew the bird is in this 20 by 20 meter block, and we could just have a very hard time to find them. So that was mainly one of our main challenges. On one hand is the late starting date of the summer project. They start after summer, when their summer break starts, so they start only mid to end of May. So the birds have been, have been busy already for a while then. And it's very time intensive, the nest searching. We did find some nests though, so we could sort of confirm that the nesting phenology, May 22nd to 31st is typically when we found a lot was the period when we find birds with nests. And then we see the first fledging around mid-June going into later June. So that already tells you, if you want to give these birds a chance, you really have to put off the mowing really until late June, early July for them to have a chance. Savannah sparrow is similar, they're a little bit earlier. So eggs we had hatching already end of May, with a large number of fledglings already early June. So they're a little bit earlier, and therefore have a little bit more of a chance also when we have a late spring, as we had, for example, last year. So the other part of the study was really focused on doing point counts, so the good old observations. And the good thing about that is that you can cover much more ground, and you can get sort of a better idea of where birds are and which habitats do we find grassland birds on Cornell. And nobody has really ever looked at that and get a really good estimate. And then really one of my goals personally was I really wanted to put a number on it. So okay, how many pairs do we have on Cornell lands? And then, to how many chicks does this amount? Because that's often the power of numbers. I mean, I work on Birdcast, and I know like the billion bird flights on Birdcast. When it's a large number and you put a number on it, then people really start to be amazed on the one hand, but also it makes it more real than just an index. So I really spent some time to try to find a sort of straightforward way to estimate numbers of birds. But I eventually landed on something that, through help from my colleagues from Canada, this is called the NA-POPS project. It has a fancy name like Point Count Offsets for Population Sizes of North American Land Birds. Basically what this project tries to do is, like, if you have a point count that gives you like, okay, so 10 birds on my count, that's hard to extrapolate from that, from how many birds are there. You kind of want to translate that count into a density. So how many birds per unit area are there? And that was this project helps us. And there's statistical techniques that are even more time consuming, like distance sampling, where you score how far a bird you detect, so that you can see how the detectability drops off with distance. Or you do time interval counts, like it's not just if you have a bird and you know it's there, it's not always calling. So even if it's there, you have to account for that, the rate at which it calls, sort of. And there's tricks also in count protocols that you can do to get a sense of those things. And this project has gathered all this data together and produced sort of like offsets that we can use to correct and get a sort of best guess of what these densities are. So what we did, the approach was like we corrected count data then for May and June. That's what I really focused on, because that's when we think most of these species are breeding. And so sort of past migration, but a little bit before the majority of fledgling. So we focused on the count data from this period. And then one important thing that we did in the protocols was and the Bird Club helped with this too, we split out the birds that you see within 100 meters, count circles, and birds beyond it. And that's very critical for these kind of approaches, because you know sort of like the maximum area what you have counted if you take only the birds within the 100 meter count circle. And then we used that NA-POPS project to sort of convert the counts to bird densities. And that depends on these offsets. They vary by the time of day to account for that birds go silent, usually later in the day. It accounts for season and when there's like a dip in breeding and birds become less active. There's also the duration of the count period, of course, also determines it. So you can plug all those things in, and then you get sort of these factors, like what's the density factor by which I have to correct it. So for bobolink, you have about a 1.8 factor. So if you do a 5-minute point count, it means you miss about 80% of the birds, according to this estimate. For eastern merlocks, it's a little lower, so it's 1.4. So you miss about 40% of the individuals that are there. So each species have a different offset like that. And I use that to convert the counts into densities. And then we can just do a lot of density averaging for each of the fields. And then I just extrapolate over the size of the fields that we have. So we didn't cover, of course, with our point counts all the area, but so we need to do some extrapolations. So think of that really as this is not like very accurate, detailed. We have to make some broad strokes here, but it really helps us to get at least to compare the different sites and get a good feel for the order of magnitude. So what do we end up with? Like how many birds are there on Cornell lands and on these few sites that I mentioned? So this is for bobolink. So you find that it's in the hundreds. So on Mount Pleasant, we find that we have about 141 individuals there. So say 70 pairs of breeding bobolink. So that's a substantial number. On Kirk, this very intensively managed site, we still have about 60 individuals. On Bluegrass, which is the horse farms near Henshaw Road, where a lot of this, maybe our frustration started, and which is close to where a lot of us live. About 20 birds, so 10 pairs, similar for Dunlop Meadow. So that brings you about 240 individuals. I also did the exact same exercise for the 3 sites that the Bird Club has been monitoring by themselves. That's Summerland, sort of south of the county near Summerhill Forest, I believe. I've never been there personally myself, But when I looked at this, I'm like, oh, I really have to go there, because that was really like, the dense. So the birds per acre are almost tripled of what we have on the other sites. A really good site. It's small, but it hosts a lot of birds, it seems. Sims Jennings is a new property in Lansing, also often managed by the Finger Lake Land Trust. Similar densities that we see in Mount Pleasant. And Lindsay Parsons. I love that place. It's not the place maybe for bobolinks and grassland birds currently. So I think that shakes out with that you guys feel is right. So then savanna sparrows. Again, Mount Pleasant is the largest site, right? So there's a lot of birds there, almost 200. Same for the ruminant center, also about 200 birds. Bluegrass also has a small population. Dunlop Meadow, not so much. And that's because of the management. The grass is typically taller there than that these birds like. But I was surprised how high the densities at this very intensively managed site are. There's singing birds everywhere there. And unfortunately, we know that probably most of these birds are not going to make it. The other sites that are managed by the Bird Club, they have very low densities of savanna sparrows. And then red-winged blackbirds, also in the hundreds, about 380 pairs over these 4 sites altogether. You might think of this also a common bird, but also these common birds, those are the ones that are really in decline. And if you think about that 3 billion birds paper, that 3 billion number is made up by these common birds for a large part. Finally, meadowlarks. A little disappointing in the end when I did the analysis. It's a handful of birds in each of these sites, and it's not. There's small numbers, so maybe 15 birds altogether on Cornell lands. So diving a little bit deeper into the analysis for the more detailed work that we did in 2023 and 2024, maybe unsurprisingly, we kept track of when the mowing happens, and it's clearly that bobolink counts are very negatively associated with mowing, right? It's sort of, don't look too much at this axis, what it actually represents, which I think it's just the raw count, actually. This is from the student work earlier. So it really drops into more than half after the first mow, and if they then mow again, they're on a 28-day cycle of mowing. The birds pretty much disappear. Another very strong effect that we see, and that was known from the literature, but we could reproduce it also in our study, is that like bobolinks, they don't like any field. So they really like a large field. And if it's too close to a forest edge, they tend to avoid it. So here we have the distance to forest edge in feet, and then sort of the expected count on a point count. It really increases if you are on these larger fields. And that's important when you think about restoration. There's maybe a lot of these smaller fields that Cornell has and doesn't do anything with, but that's not really doing the trick for this particular species. They need these open, broad landscapes. Another surprising thing, or to some extent, like Dunlop Meadows was our gold standard managed for grassland bird site. If you compare to Mount Pleasant, our fairly intensively managed site, the densities are not that different. So it's like Mount Pleasant just looks attractive to a bobolink and to other grassland birds. Nice hay fields when you come there in April, looks very attractive. And a lot of these species are opportunistically also moving in, and they just find these places and start, and therefore densities are low. Kirk, though, a little bit lower, but still surprisingly high. We still have bobolinks singing there in quite a fair number of densities. So I was kind of surprised maybe that our real site, which is managed for grassland birds, wasn't even a lot better. I think maybe the Summerland site, I didn't include it here, seems to suggest you can really reach maybe even higher densities. Then finally, I think this figure here compares the bobolink abundance in early and late sites. So early is sort of end of May, mid-June, and then late is after July, so after really fledgling. So you see, of course, there's a huge drop in all the sites that are managed for hay, except for Dunlop Meadow, and there we see sort of the inverse. And that was especially strong in 2023. It seems to be like this is a good site, and then everything gets cut, and these birds, they have to go somewhere, and they sort of tend to aggregate, therefore, in these sort of remaining patches that are there. So in that sense, Dunlop Meadow also has a role for these stopover birds and birds after fletching and sort of after mowing, unfortunately, as well. So it shows the value of these sites sort of also outside of the breeding season, which was interesting. Here's another way to show that. Here we have the bobolink abundance per count. There's this huge peak where there's a huge numbers of birds showing up at this site. It's around mid-July, before migration. So that was interesting. And something that Todd Bittner, who is the manager and who really advocated for the site, was very, very excited to learn about that. So I said already, like in 2025, we didn't do as much field work, but thanks to the Bird Club, we did continue the monitoring on the sites we had established. So thanks again so much for that, because that makes the data better. But for the student project, we decided to focus. We had a feeling like, okay, we have a ballpark idea of where these birds are and the densities, but what we don't really understand, though, is the managers, the land managers, and like what is their flexibility to change these practices, and why are they mowing so early? Is that really necessary, So we decided to have these interviews we aimed for 4 people, but in the end, we interviewed only 3. The last one, and like last year was just a crazy year with like very wet, and it was like kind of a disaster for farmers. For birds it was better because they couldn't mow actually for like until like beginning of June. So birds had a shot actually that year, but they were totally swamped at the ruminant center, so we didn't get to talk to them. Hopefully I can do that this year. But so we talked to Cornell AES. AES is the Agricultural Experimental Station. Sean Bossart is sort of the land manager there, and they have a lot of fields along Henshaw Road, especially the eastern part, and also quite a lot of fields on Mount Pleasant. So that's research fields essentially for the university. Then we talked to the Equine Park on Henshaw Road. So they own a lot of fields along Bluegrass Lane, the majority of it. So Jessica Crum is there, the manager. We talked to Todd Bittner, who is the director of the Cornell Botanic Gardens for natural areas, and animal sciences. We got still quite a bit of information through Sean, who knows them quite well. So we have some information on that through those interviews. I posted in the slides of what we showed these land managers and the question that we asked. I'm gonna go through it pretty quickly. It's just to give you a sense of like what did we ask. We don't have to go through these whole slides, but I asked about their hay production and what their livestock needs. How much do they need? What do they feed them? When were they mowing and how early? And are they open to delaying in their first cuts? And can they maybe do delayed second cut where you cut maybe early, but then you give the birds a chance to re-nest and maybe have a full. We thought of we compiled all these different strategies you see in the literature, and we sort of asked the question: can you do this? So these different bird-friendly practices. We asked them about their operational considerations. So what does it cost to mow? How would this complicate your work? Do they make these mowing decisions themselves, or are there contractors they bring in and that they decide for them? Could they raise the blade, which helps for certain species, like Savannah sparrow? Nutrition, trying to understand like how important is it really that they have this high quality early cut hay, because that's the thing. I mean, we haven't talked about that much. Like hay it's not constant. So once it starts to sort of get these little seed sets on it, the fiber content goes up, and it has less protein in it, and the protein is what the farmers are usually and the cows are after. So the question is like, do their animals really need that? If not, could you supplement it? So lots and lots of questions that we asked them. Would they be willing to have incentives to compensate them if they were to join into such a program to offset the costs? So there was, I have to say I learned a lot from these conversations. It's very interesting to sit with these people and learn from them and learn a bit about what's involved with farming. And it's a little humbling to see how complex and how complicated it is. So these are a little bit not very nicely slides, but I would try to summarize sort of like for several of these people what we learned. So first, maybe our most conservation focused sub-organization of Cornell, the Botanic Gardens, and Todd Bittner. So they really manage for biodiversity, and they really try to support research and teaching. So it's in that sense, the Botanic Gardens is a little different than a land trust, for example, that just tries to get land and protect as much as they can. That's not fully their mission. They try to more have a balanced portfolio of all these different habitats that are occurring in New York State, and that's then where the research can occur and where they can teach students to do the various things. So I learned that that Dunlop Meadow is great. I think they would be open to replicating that in more places, but there's definitely a hesitancy also, like put on more and more habitat to manage. That's a lot for them too, and there's cost involved with that. So it would definitely be in conservation, a conversation, also, even though it wouldn't be a definite no. They are also heavily involved in the Cornell's carbon sequestration group. So that's a whole other initiative and a whole other effort in Cornell. So Cornell has set these goals to be carbon neutral in like 2035, and there's many ways to do that. One is just plant more trees, but I think Todd very much recognizes that, well, we have already a lot of trees, and not in every situation that's the best way to do, or even to sequester carbon. And like especially warm season grasses is like a pretty not very common habitat. So that sequesters a lot of carbon as well. So there's really maybe an opportunity to have these goals of carbon sequestration align with what you want for grassland birds. So I think we have a good ally in the Botanic Gardens to pushing for maybe solutions along those lines, getting involved with the carbon sequestration groups and goals of Cornell to see, is that a way in which we can make this happen? Then we have the Cornell Agricultural Experiment Station, or AES. So they're mostly on Henshaw Road and Mount Pleasant. Again, these people don't have any animals. There's only research. They mostly grow switchgrass for bioenergy research, but they have more land than they manage. So a lot of it is leased out to the dairy operation that's at Harvard, and they sort of decide the mowing schedules. But for themselves, the research needs are really set. The mowing schedules are set by research needs, and often that's a little bit more flexible. So they do their own mowing there, so there's more control. And Sean, is also, I really see him also as an ally in this, even though he comes from a farming background. He had some interesting stories about like the complexity of it and how hard it is for these farmers. Even they care about the land too. And I said the worst thing that I do every year is when I had to do like the first cut, because he just knows like he's cutting away all these animals and he hates it, but he doesn't really have another. The operation also needs these hays, and there's just no other way. So. Very open though to like thinking about this and thinking about ways how can we have some land for both, and very willing to work on restoration, and has been very helpful also in pointing to some of the fields that he has under his stewardship that we could maybe think about managing more for conservation and grassland birds. Then we have the equine facility. The horse farm on the Bluegrass Lane. That's where I think a lot of us were seeing the birds being mowed out in front of our house. So that is also a complicated story. So they have about 55 teaching horses and 30 research horses, 85 in total. And they have actually, over the years, been consolidating. The forces were all over campus. They have been consolidating actually on hand-show roads. So what you can expect is for the operation actually there not to reduce, but to intensify, unfortunately, in the coming years. And they have been purchasing more land that will be grown for hay. And what's something that struck me here is like how little control and how little control they have on the mowing, because they have to lease that out to contractors that is already almost doing them a favor to come when they have an own farm, and they come when they have a little time. So she was like, yeah, I'm almost hesitant to ask this person to delay, when it's even possible on a wet year like last year, because she's sort of afraid to lose this farmer doing that work for them and asking too many questions. But she also was very clear that, they really need that high nutrient hay. It's just something that their breeding horses need. And she is already, like, even if she cuts everything, she is already short. So they buy like 200 tons of first cut and second cut hay that's being grown elsewhere in the country, being brought in, which shows you, like, it's not that they have a ton of land, or more like they're short on land to grow the grass that they need. So it's also a financially tight operation. They were very happy that they have all these renovations in recent year. If you've seen new sheds going up there on the Equine Center, so they had finally a big one-time donor that made it possible. But still, the daily operation is every year a struggle. So last year was a real struggle, just because they couldn't mow for these grassland birds on that little patch in grassland. That was a $40,000 hit in real money that they had to find somewhere else. And that's what I noticed. Like, Cornell's is rich university, you think, but then in reality, everybody is struggling to keep their research programs running, to do the things that they want to do. So it was a little humbling to learn how tight everything is and how not straightforward it is to change things. And then finally, Kirk. I think that's the most aggressively managed operation. And you saw Greg Johnson earlier in the video. He just runs this production thing on 4 cuts a year, 4 to 5 cuts a year, I think, even. And there's no way that grassland birds can survive there. A humbling story maybe, and in that sense I was left a little disappointed in the way that there's not an easy way to like delay mowing. And I was left after talking to all these people that the way forward seems to be much more feasible is that Cornell does have a lot of land, and it's a lot, and there's definitely land that's not being used and it's sort of fallow. And I think, I'm not saying that maybe these farmers are all right, that there really isn't a way in which, if they really, really wanted to change something, but I think it will be a very hard battle for us to try to change these operations. And probably a much more easy approach for Cornell land, at least, is to seek, are there fields that are just not being used and that we could use to restore? Not maybe just only grassland birds, but maybe think more broadly, insects, native plants, and is there a way to do it along those routes? So a good thing is that carbon sequestration initiative that has been going around at the university in recent years. So they have a pretty good, and they didn't used to have that, a pretty good inventory now of which fields do they own, who owns it, what's the plan with it, and they're starting to think, okay, like what are we going to do with these fields? Are it's going to be afforestation? Is it going to be warm season grasses? And sort of we have to now try to find a way to sort of tap into that discussion and sort of advocate for grassland birds to be considered in those plans as well. And it has gone pretty concretely already. So we went through all these sites, and I visited with the student of last year. We went to visit these various sites that are currently being considered and that are not being used. And I just wanted to sort of take you along that journey and show you a few of these fields, and to give you a sense of where they are and what we could do. So here we are. I'm not sure how good your geography is, but like this is the Henshaw Road. This is Henshaw Road. This is where the horse farm is, and this is the lab is sort of a little bit above there. So this is very close to here, and I'll indicate in this light blue every time the fields that are currently not being used. So here's a big field that is not being used, managed by AES. They're very open to maybe mowing it or doing something with it. They just need the funds to actually do that and start doing that. This corner field here is also owned by the horse farm, but it's also very wet and they have never been using it. So I think some politics, maybe this whole area could be used. Here's also a field that some of the birders that go to this area might know. This is the big switchgrass field that's not being mown for many years. There were some marsh wrens or sedge wrens. 4 sedge wrens were there at some point, if you remember. It's that field. Not being used currently, so that's also a conversation we could have. It's not super big, but it is right in the right area, so I think that's promising. This is another field. This is near, if you know the Cornell sports fields, they have the new athletic fields that have been being built a little south of campus. So this is Ellis Hollow Road here, going out here. And yeah, this is what Todd Bittner told me. If you want an easy bang for your buck, this field is still mostly grass. It's just not been mowed for several years. So if you would just start mowing this, it might produce good habitat for grassland birds. The only catch is that the athletics fields, there's not a long-term commitment from the athletics organization to put that field in grassland birds. So maybe it's 10 years, you know, and that's a conversation we need to have. Is that worth investing our time in, a sort of short-term solution? Maybe it is. And I mean, these Bobolink have been very flexible in finding sites, and they are opportunistic. So it could be a way, but of course it's maybe a little less gratifying to know that this is not a long-term solution potentially. Here's a few photos of what that field looks like. It's mostly grown. There's some patches definitely with a lot of goldenrod growing already. And that's what you have to think of for the cost. Like the easiest if you can just start mowing it. That's a few $1,000s maybe for a fairly decent field, for 15 acres or something. Then if you need to plow it, that's the second level, and reseed it. You know, that gets more expensive, maybe $10,000. And then if you have a field that's not been managed for a long time, you have these big honeysuckles coming up, and they just cannot get into it anymore with the big machines. So then you need to really redo that whole field, and that gets even more expensive. So it's really there's just trade-off, like what's easy and what's doable. This is near Stevenson Road. So here's the compost piles here. You see the little compost piles lined up. Here's the big solar farm. So these fields around here, they're also, I think, if I remember correctly, also AES. So the experimental station, agricultural experimental station, not really being in used. I kind of didn't have the photos ready for these, but I remember there's quite a bit of goldenrod there. So I think these fields need some work if you ever want to make them suitable for grassland birds. Here we are on Mount Pleasant. So here's the little observatory, where you have the stargazing, and right next to that there's a farm here. This field here is also a corner field that is kind of wet. There's a lot of bobolinks here actually, so this is also under consideration. Here you see Violet taking some photos here near the farm, but if you look in that, you see these big honeysuckles already popping up. So it's not going to be easy to convert this, but it is there, and it's right on Mount Pleasant, right in our core area of a lot of bobolink. Harvard is more challenging, but there was one field here that's pretty nice, which was, at least it was pretty to visit. and looks out a little bit over the valley, so you have very nice views. A little bit more elevation. It does near the forest edge, but I thought potentially that could also be a decent field where we could do something. So in that sense, I am optimistic that there is, with a lot of goodwill, there are possibilities to do more for grassland birds within the university. But there's a lot of, I think the hard work starts now, like where you have to start talking to people. Money is becoming an issue, convincing more, not me, not just Adriaan Dokter, but like the high level decision makers to go on board with considering this more into their plans. This is the hard part, and maybe the part that we've been run into before, and not undoable. And you have to also think like the project of the last few years. That means Sarah, me, and Dave Bonter. We do that little summer project with the students, right? That's not a full-time person who's working on this. Like that's also maybe a discussion we need to have within the Lab of Ornithology. Like, is this a priority, and how we're gonna get it done? So to sum up, like I think we learned that there's about, if you sum up these 4 core species of us, there's about 1,000 breeding adult grassland birds on Cornell Land. Most of them get mowed out, unfortunately. So I don't know how many chicks that is, but it's a substantial number of birds, which that number I think we can use in sort of advocating for that something needs to change. We also found that early and repeated mowing on the hay production fields, there's very little reproductive success. So I love going to Mount Pleasant, but in a way, if you're there, it's like an ecological trap. It looks nice, these birds go there, and then they get killed, or they don't have any reproductive success. So in that sense, you sometimes think it's these weird things that you can start to think like, oh, maybe this super intensive thing in Harvard is actually better because they're being removed and sort of go elsewhere more quickly. The ecological trap is not as bad, but So given the goals of Cornell's land stewards in producing hay for animals, my conviction is that sort of getting delayed mowing regimes on those hay production fields will be very challenging because they really very, very strongly feel about this high quality hay for their. It doesn't need it for the cows and for the horses, and so there's not really another way. And this is the tragedy of like grassland bird conservation all over the country. Also, when you think about farming and intensive farming, but I do think there's maybe a path forward in having more dedicated habitat for these birds that are mixed within these intensive fields, and that's I think what we should focus on. Because we do see that these strategies like Dunlop Meadow are very effective, where we have a lot of birds that do well, and we have that forest edge effect that we found. So that's what I think the next step. I already said this a little bit. I think we should focus on habitats restoration instead of maybe trying to do both things at the same time on fields, which I'm not convinced it's not possible. I think it will be very hard. You enter sort of a real big struggle with these landowners, and I think they are really sympathetic to our cause. Actually, it's not that they don't care about birds. It's more the opposite. But they have all these other complex goals that they need to meet, and that's what makes it complicated. I think we also want to grow, so that it moves more to people from research in the field. It moves more to like convincing and changing practices in people. We have to grow more of these campus and Cornell Lab connections and get consensus even within the Lab of Ornithology to work on this. A cool initiative is like what Ferry's in the room actually right there. She's leading a very cool restoration project in Sapsucker Woods, where there was a big donation, for example, to do something about invasive species. So that shows that it is possible, and this is very close to the Lab of Ornithology, but it shows you there is possible to raise funds around these issues and maybe do something more. And so funding becomes a thing, like connect more with there's sort of two paths, either public, local fundraising, but maybe the Bird Club could have a role in, but also more specifically, I think Cornell has the Lab of Ornithology has a lot of experience in fundraising, and we have to explore more if that grassland birds is something we could work around for that thing. And now more specifically about the future of the Bird Club project. I mean, we have now these few candidate fields, right? And I showed a few of them. There's more. I think I visited only once in July with students. It's not a very good assessment of like what's there. So I would really encourage you, if the Bird Club is interested, could we visit some of these sites and do a little bit better job knowing what is there and what is promising for restoration? That will really help to make the case to these land stewards and in the conversations that are coming, like, oh, we really think this is a great opportunity, and back it up with some data. So that's a good one. Knowing more about phenology and when breeding success happens is challenging. I think by continuing the point counts that we have, we get more data around that, especially if you write down seeing birds with food, seeing feeding birds, those are the important observations that really proves they're breeding there and that they have young. So that's important to continue building that, and I hope we can continue with the Bird Club to work on that. And lots of other connections and partnership building that needs to happen, maybe also in connecting with research at Cornell around biodiversity. That's a lot of words. I want to thank you all for listening. I'm not sure that Bobolink is saying thank you yet, but I do think there's a path forward, and we have to just keep pushing on it. So thank you all for your attention.